When you hear the name Christopher Nolan, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For many, the answer to that question would be Interstellar. Released in 2014, Interstellar stars Matthew McConaughey as Joseph Cooper, a NASA pilot turned farmer following a global famine. After it's discovered that the situation on Earth is doomed, he is chosen to go on an interstellar expedition to find mankind's new home. But as anyone who has seen the movie will tell you, it's about so much more than that. Nolan cites Star Wars and 2001: A Space Odyssey as two films that had a great impact on him as a child and inspired his love of filmmaking. It's only natural then that he'd eventually take a crack at the space adventure genre himself. Upon release though, reviews for Interstellar were above average but largely unremarkable. Notably, it only received a 73% on Rotten Tomatoes, the lowest score of Nolan's career up to that point, and the second lowest score he's received to this day. Now of course, Rotten Tomatoes reviews aren't exactly gospel, but they weren't alone in this opinion. While no one dared say it was a bad film, many reviewers couldn't look beyond what they saw as glaring flaws. Fast forward to 2025, and the consensus on Interstellar has shifted. It's now often considered one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made. On IMDb, it holds the 18th spot on the site's top 250 highest rated movies. And when it was re-released in December 2024, it became the single most successful IMAX re-release ever. Why did this shift occur? How come critics didn't seem to fully understand the movie on release? And what effect did Interstellar have on Nolan's career and the sci-fi genre? Today we'll be finding the answers to those questions, and in the coming weeks, I'll be taking a look at each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now without further ado, let's get into Christopher Nolan's masterpiece, Interstellar. The story behind Interstellar's production begins in 1980, when film producer Linda Obst and theoretical physicist Kip Thorne were set up on a blind date by their mutual friend, Carl Sagan. Though the two never did begin any sort of romantic relationship, they later collaborated on the 1997 film, Contact. Following this, the two wrote an 8-page treatment for a science fiction movie, which they presented to Paramount. And in June of 2006, development began on what would become Interstellar. The project had also attracted the attention of Steven Spielberg, who intended to direct it. Then, in March of 2007, Jonathan Nolan would be brought on to write the screenplay. At this point, everything seemed to be looking good for this then unnamed science fiction project. But in 2009, due to some contractual issues with Spielberg's production company, he parted ways with Paramount, which meant the project would have to find a new director. Fortunately, Jonathan Nolan knew a guy who was up to the task, and in 2013, it was officially announced that Christopher Nolan was working on a new science fiction film entitled Interstellar. Jonathan Nolan had spent the past 4 years writing a script, working closely with Kip Thorne along the way. And once Christopher Nolan was brought on, he selected among several of their ideas, merging them with the script he had been working on for a while on his own. Apparently, almost the whole first hour was left intact from Jonathan's script, and personally, this is one of my favorite parts of the narrative. One of the most interesting aspects of the opening on my first viewing were the interviews discussing what it was like to live on this post-apocalyptic Earth. It provides necessary exposition in a way that grabs the audience's attention, and with how perfectly these fit into the story, I never would have guessed that most of them were taken from an actual documentary. That documentary being The Dust Bowl, directed by Ken Burns. As the story goes, Christopher Nolan had watched the documentary for inspiration, and ended up contacting Ken Burns for permission to use the interview segments in Interstellar. And to tie all of it together, an interview was recorded in a similar style for the character of Murph. Through Murph's interview, we're introduced to our protagonist, Cooper, played by Matthew McConaughey, and it goes without saying that he did a phenomenal job here. Nolan has a way of casting actors that I never even would have considered for certain roles, and then they proceed to give a career-defining performance. It happened with Heath Ledger's Joker, and in my eyes, this performance is almost up there in terms of how unexpectedly fantastic it is. If you handed me the exact script for Interstellar, I'm not sure Matthew McConaughey would have come to mind at all, but it fits him perfectly. He has the rare ability to express incomprehensibly heartbreaking emotions one minute, then appear cool and confident the next, and both are equally as believable. I know people make jokes about his crying sometimes, but this exaggerated expression really captures the depth of his sadness in this moment. Like I said, it is an incomprehensible emotion because this scenario is next to impossible in our reality. And since this is the case, several actors in this cast would be required to express these complex emotions. Notable performances include Anne Hathaway as Amelia Brand, Jessica Chastain as Murph, and Matt Damon as Dr. Mann. Anne Hathaway has several tough scenes here, and for the most part, she does a great job in each. To be honest, I didn't love her character at first, but she definitely becomes better on repeat viewings. Her speech on the power of love didn't fully land on my first viewing, but as I came to appreciate her perspective more, it really fixed the character for me. I only bring this up because I know her character gets some hate for all the mistakes she makes in this story, but I would recommend for anyone who disliked her to try to consider the events from her perspective, and especially by her philosophy. Under these circumstances, she proved to be a more tragic and significantly deeper character than I anticipated. Jessica Chastain also proves to be underrated in my opinion. She does a great job with many of her scenes, but the one that stuck out to me was her argument with Tom, played by Casey Affleck, specifically when she screams about how their dad didn't even try to save them. That line delivery is gut-wrenching, and it especially hurts the audience since we know that isn't true, as we're currently watching Cooper try his best not only to save them, but get back to them. And finally, for notable performances, is Matt Damon. On my initial viewing, I knew absolutely nothing about Interstellar other than what the title implies, so naturally I was shocked during the Dr. Man unboxing sequence. And Damon ends up playing a role that's reminiscent of his character in The Departed. It really is unfortunate how good he is at playing the unlikable traitor, but it definitely works here. Though he doesn't get much screen time, his sequence still ends up being one of the most memorable parts of Interstellar, in large part because of his performance, but also because of just how beautiful this setting is. And clearly someone in the marketing team agreed, as it's used for almost all of the film's promotional material. Nolan's usual cinematographer, Wally Pfister, unfortunately couldn't return for Interstellar as he was busy filming his directorial debut, Transcendence. He would later retire as a cinematographer, making The Dark Knight Rises the last time the two collaborate. He was replaced by Hoyt van Hoytema, who does a fantastic job. And clearly Nolan liked him too, as he would continue working with him down to today, with the two currently working on The Odyssey. And as is always notable with a Nolan production, the use of IMAX in Interstellar is incredible. The larger image really helps sell the vastness of space and these planets. I think I do still prefer The Dark Knight Rises use of IMAX overall, but that's not in any way a knock against Interstellar. Given the nature of this story, it would initially seem like Nolan would have to use more CGI than was typical for him, but that didn't end up being the case. Everything that could be done practically was done practically, whether that be through digital projection, puppeteering, or miniatures. A surprising amount of what we see in Interstellar is exactly what was captured by the camera. Personally, I don't mind the use of CG in film as much as some others, but I do agree that something is lost when the settings are completely CG. Notably, no green screens were used for Interstellar, and this helps not only the actors, but also the tangibility of the environment carries over to the viewers as well. Nathan Crowley returned as production designer in Interstellar, and his contributions cannot be overstated. The designs of the spaceships and their interiors are phenomenal, and the quality of the miniatures is incredible. One particularly inspired design is the Endurance. It has 12 capsules, resembling a clock, which emphasizes the importance of time in this narrative. Also, over 500 acres of corn were actually planted for the scenes taking place at the farm. This likely could have easily been done with CGI, but again, that tangibility grounds the environment in reality, which is especially vital during that section of the story. Another notable aspect of the production design are the robots, TARS and Case. I'm not sure if this was intentional, but they almost seem to resemble the Monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Either way, they're great characters, especially TARS, and the effects on these were accomplished largely using puppetry, with VFX only being used for specific sequences and also to remove Bill Irwin, who did the puppeteering along with providing the voice for TARS. That's not to say no CGI was used in Interstellar though. In fact, it was used to great effect, even to a revolutionary degree, with the black hole scenes in particular apparently taking up to 800 terabytes of storage and aiding in scientific research due to their accuracy. And aside from just being accurate, they're also mesmerizing. While anyone would struggle to find any fault in the visuals for Interstellar, the same can't be said of the audio. Unfortunately, during specific sequences, it can be very difficult to hear the characters, let alone understand what they're saying. I found myself fiddling with the volume throughout almost the entirety of the film's runtime. And you can't just raise the volume either, because the action sequences are very loud, which is understandable. Nolan has stated that, at times, the audience being unable to make out what the characters are saying was intentional, for instance during very loud moments. And this is fine, but this problem extends beyond those moments. One line that immediately comes to mind is when Cooper explains how his wife died. It's just way too quiet, especially given the fact that I can hear the other characters in this scene just fine. The dialogue is just a part of the auditory experience in Interstellar though, with the other parts being absolutely flawless. And I'm specifically referring to the score. As is typical for Nolan, Hans Zimmer did the soundtrack, and I have no other words for it other than perfection. As much as I love Inception's score, Interstellar is the greatest work of Hans Zimmer's career in my opinion, and the story of how it was put together is equally as fascinating. Instead of giving Zimmer any major plot details, Nolan simply gave him one page with some dialogue from the script. Specifically, the story seemed to focus on the relationship between a father and his son, and what Zimmer came up with became the foundation of Interstellar's soundtrack. Later into production, the pipe organ would be brought in, played by Roger Sayer. Nolan stated that he wanted the organ because it brought a measure of religiosity, which he felt represented mankind's portrayal of the metaphysical, which Interstellar does dive into with its final act. Also, the pipe organ comes with the very human limitation of requiring air to be played. yet it still is capable of producing these grandiose sounds. In a sense, it breathes. Nolan felt this did a good job of capturing not just the space, but also the people in that space, which is really what the story's about. To quote him directly, he said, "There's an intimacy as well as massive scale. Though it probably wouldn't have been the first choice of many, the pipe organ proved to suit this story beautifully." Interstellar has by far my favorite soundtrack of any film I've ever seen, and personally, it really isn't up for debate. Within the context of the story, it's moving, but even on its own, I could never get tired of this score. I mentioned at the outset how the critical response to Interstellar was somewhat underwhelming, but commercially, it actually did really well. On a budget of $165 million, Interstellar grossed $681 million on release. Clearly, audiences seemed to enjoy the movie. So what was it about Interstellar that critics seem to be mixed on? I touched on the events of roughly the first hour of the film previously, but really there's a lot more to be said about this portion of the story. As I mentioned, this section of the story was left almost entirely intact from Jonathan Nolan's original script, and this was definitely for the best. Most Nolan movies pride themselves on their relative realism. Despite movies like Batman Begins and Inception having many concepts that could be considered larger than life, they still remained mostly grounded in reality. And Interstellar is no different. Of course, there's the impressive scientific accuracy, which we'll get into momentarily, but a big part of grounding a story in reality is establishing proper stakes. The events of the first hour quite literally ground the film in a way that ensures the time-bending and especially metaphysical elements later on have a proper impact on the audience. For example, when our protagonists enter the wormhole, or when Cooper first sees the giant wave on Miller's planet, these awe-inspiring spectacles are felt just as strongly by the audience as they are by the characters, in large part due to the excellent effects, production design, cinematography, and music, but also because the opening of the story establishes that these moments are in fact extraordinary. It's the exact opposite of what a sci-fi story like Star Wars does, where Star Wars intentionally minimizes the importance of groundbreaking technologies so that the viewer can become fully immersed in a unique and fantastical universe. Interstellar reminds the audience of reality so that they can fully relate to the reactions these characters have to the events taking place. We also are familiarized with what exactly Cooper is fighting for in this first act. This ensures that the emotional beats of this story hit as hard as they need to. I love everything about this opening act, but it has been a cause of complaint for some, mostly because of its length. Some audience members seem to have been dissatisfied that in a film titled Interstellar, the characters don't actually go to space until almost a third of the way into the movie. Personally, I find no issue with this, and I'm glad the people levying these complaints aren't the ones writing movies. Realistically, could you shorten the opening? Yes, but Interstellar would become a much worse film overall. Another complaint Interstellar commonly receives is audience members believing it to be too confusing. Now, there is some pretty complex science at play here. However, at no point does the movie require the audience to understand something that isn't explained within the film itself. And for those who would like a deeper understanding of the science, much more than is necessary to understand the plot, Kip Thorne wrote a tie-in book entitled The Science of Interstellar. I will reiterate though, this tie-in book is not necessary to get the basic plot. If you didn't understand Interstellar to a degree where it actively hindered your viewing experience, this book is not going to help you. For the sake of transparency, I just spent the past half hour writing an overly long tangent on how irritating this particular complaint is to me. But for the sake of time and relevance, I'll just leave it at this. I don't think there's anything wrong with not explaining every little detail in the story. I also don't think there's anything wrong with assuming that the audience has a basic knowledge of a concept within your story beforehand. That being said, Interstellar still doesn't do either of those things. It explains every small detail that is relevant to the plot, sometimes even bending over backwards for the sake of providing an explanation. For example, when Romilly explains how wormholes work to Cooper, who is quite literally a NASA pilot, he should already be more than familiar with the concept, but the scene is here only because the audience probably isn't. Interstellar does everything in its power to remain as accessible as possible, and yet some still find cause for complaint because they couldn't be bothered with the science in a science fiction movie. To summarize this whole point, I don't think saying Interstellar is too confusing is a legitimate complaint. And just as an example of why this isn't a legitimate complaint, let's use one of the best sequences in the movie, Miller's Planet. And honestly, if I made a list of some of my favorite scenes in cinema history, this would probably be on it. There's lots of technical stuff at play here. Due to the planet's close proximity to a black hole, time passes faster there. It's stated that every hour on the planet is 7 years back on Earth. This is all the information the audience needs to understand the stakes, and it's directly stated by Romilly's character. Once they arrive, we get that incredible line which revealed the mountains in the distance are actually waves, and the shot where Cooper finally sees the wave is perfect. The pan up really sells just how massive this wave is, and the music coming in just as the camera reaches the peak is incredible. The performances, the cinematography, the setting, the music, it all comes together to create one of the most memorable moments of the film, and in my opinion, cinematic history. And if the audience was curious as to why Miller's planet had such large waves, the tie-in book explains how these were caused by its close proximity to the black hole. And that's all the book is meant to be. Supplemental information that enhances the audience's appreciation for the work put into grounding the story in reality. But the Miller's Planet sequence is just as easily understood and profoundly mesmerizing with just the context we receive within the film itself. The main reason this too confusing complaint bothers me so much, though, is because of just how much effort went into making sure Interstellar's narrative made sense from a scientific perspective. As was mentioned, theoretical physicist Kip Thorne not only was involved in the original 8-page draft that would become Interstellar, but he also was consulted on every aspect of the story that pertained to his field. Interstellar did something unique for a science fiction movie, in that it was attempting to be as scientifically accurate as possible. Kip Thorne had set up 2 rules very early in development. First, nothing would violate established physics laws, and second, all the wild speculations would spring from science and not from the mind of a screenwriter. And this was done for the sake of preserving scientific accuracy. Yes, there are many elements in Interstellar that have not been proven. In fact, most of the plot relies on theory, but nothing within has been disproven either. Apparently, the element that was allowed the most artistic freedom were the frozen clouds on man's planet, which of course would not be possible naturally. The frozen clouds were probably not the thing that caused audiences to suspend their disbelief the most, though. Now, that would definitely be the Tesseract sequence, which transforms the setting into the metaphysical. And to be completely honest, I struggled with this moment on my first viewing. Not because it's difficult to understand, but rather because I felt that it was a cop-out. The opening of Interstellar contained many unexplained happenings that I trusted would be expounded on later, and admittedly, I felt let down. That wasn't until I gave Interstellar a second chance a few months later, and I realized it all ties into Amelia Brand's speech that I mentioned earlier. After my first viewing, I didn't understand Interstellar at a fundamental level. I was so focused on the science that I failed to even attempt to comprehend what the story was actually trying to convey. When Christopher Nolan asked Hans Zimmer to begin working on the score for Interstellar, he didn't tell him about space travel or a post-apocalyptic Earth. Instead, he simply asked him to write something to represent a relationship between a father and his son. Later on into the production, the dynamic was shifted to a father and his daughter, but the core of the idea remains unchanged. Interstellar isn't a story about saving the human race. It's about a relationship between a father and his daughter. It's about the power of love and the indomitable human spirit. Initially, my problem with the ending of Interstellar was that it felt random, but really that couldn't be further from the truth. I came to this conclusion because I was so preoccupied with what was happening, instead of considering why it was happening. And the movie foreshadows these events in the black hole several times beforehand. The very first line Murph says is, "I thought you were the ghost." She literally tells us the plot twist in the opening moments, but it's such a faraway concept that it's almost impossible anyone made this connection before the actual reveal. This is another benefit of the grounded opening act. The ending becomes completely unpredictable, as we think we're familiar with what exactly is possible in this universe. Another thing I missed in my first viewing that made the ending feel random were the many parallels and references to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I mentioned Tar's design earlier, but also the whole launch sequence draws many parallels to 2001, and considering all these references to 2001, I probably should have expected the main character to become a god at the end. I don't think it's ever been confirmed that the Tesseract sequence was inspired by 2001's ending, but it seems highly likely. The biggest reason the ending isn't out of place, though, is because of how it perfectly wraps up all the themes that have been established throughout the story. I've always described Interstellar as a love letter to humanity. Cooper said it best in the opening act. Humans are meant to be explorers and pioneers. Even though the Earth seemed to be turning on humanity, they still managed to survive through it all. That resilience, that strong will to live is what sets humans apart. Yet, in this praise of humanity, Interstellar doesn't shy away from the failures of man. In a not-so-subtle way, Dr. Mann serves as an allegory for the worst of mankind. Anne Hathaway's character, Amelia, actually hints at this just before going into cryosleep. Right after talking about Dr. Mann, she coincidentally mentions how she doesn't believe nature is evil. The only evil they'll encounter is what they bring with them. And that truly did end up being the case. Yes, what happened on Miller's planet was unfortunate, but there was no malice in those waves. Whereas Dr. Mann's betrayal stems from selfishness. A selfishness that motivates him to murder. It's the evil of humanity in its purest form. Even in this future where mankind has begun to explore new galaxies, they still find a way to fight and betray one another. Ironically though, just before Mann betrays Cooper, he explains why he's going to lose. Mann's will to live extends only to himself. he claims he's doing this for the sake of the mission, but if that were the case, he would have told them the truth just after he woke up. His real motivation is simply the desire to extend his own life by any means necessary. On the other hand, Cooper's will to live extends to his children through the love he has for them, a love that extends beyond the reaches of time and space. This love has motivated his every action since the beginning of this story, and in this instance, it saves his life. And this whole sequence with man shows where the perseverance of mankind comes from. In man's selfishness, he not only accidentally ends his own life, but also puts the entirety of the human race at risk. Keep in mind, on board the Endurance were the fertilized eggs in case Plan A failed, and man knew this when he attempted to dock. On the other hand, Cooper's selflessness, motivated by his love for his children, encourages him to do what is necessary, which leads to another one of the best scenes in the film. The visuals, the stakes, and yet again the music work together to create a scene that is not easily replicated and is profoundly moving. Not to mention the spinning of the Endurance, which was made to resemble a clock, in effect representing Cooper's fight against time. And then of course the larger implication of the scene being the fact that love is what allows mankind to accomplish the impossible. It is the ultimate motivating force, emanating from some unknown dimension that transcends all that we know, just as Brand mentioned in her speech. Brand's speech on love seems to become more powerful upon each rewatch, and it proves to be the basis to this whole ending. She rightly describes love as existing outside of human parameters, like space, time, and even gravity. And while this is a profound message, at the time she says this, love appears to be clouding her judgment. After the aforementioned sequence with man, though, it seems that she may have had a point, and that point is proven when Cooper uses love, this force from a higher dimension, to guide him through the Tesseract. My realization of this theme is what finally made the Tesseract sequence hit home for me. A complaint that has plagued Nolan throughout his career is that he's too logical. Some claim that his films lack that emotional core. That couldn't be further from the truth for Interstellar. Few narratives have resonated with me as deeply as Interstellar's. On several occasions, I found myself nearly brought to tears by the incomprehensibly heartbreaking events taking place. The obvious example is the scene where Cooper watches 23 years worth of messages, slowly realizing just how much of his children's lives he missed. Somehow, even after several rewatches, this scene hasn't lost any impact on me. And the editing plays a big role in this. A frequent collaborator with Nolan, Lee Smith, served as editor for Interstellar, and yet again, he did a fantastic job. Each cut is deliberate, and the focus is largely on Cooper, which is vital in making this moment as impactful as possible. The scene ends with a seamless transition back to Earth as Murph ends the message, reiterating how integral the connection between Cooper and Murph is in this story. And the scene where the two finally reunite always manages to have a tremendous impact on me. And a big reason for this is because we saw her struggle alongside him. Not only her struggle to survive and to fight for the human race, but also fighting that doubt whether her dad left her there to die. Seeing Cooper finally fulfill his promise, and most importantly, Murph overcoming that doubt, is incredibly moving. And in typical Nolan fashion, the ending beyond this is left very open-ended, with Cooper leaving to meet with Amelia on Edmund's planet, mankind's promising last hope at survival. Interstellar is a masterpiece. Though critics may not have seen it upon release, this fact has become more and more evident as time has gone on. I think critics fell into the same trap I did upon my first viewing, getting too caught up in the what and not focusing enough on the why. Nolan films always tend to engage the audience's mind, and I think that was the mindset both myself and others may have gone into it with initially. But in a way that no project of his had done up to this point, Interstellar requires the viewer's heart to be in it as well. That's not to say Interstellar isn't mentally engaging though. Keeping up with the plot and all the theoretical physics stuff still takes effort on the viewer's part, but it's unlikely that the mind-bending aspects of Interstellar are what primarily stuck with viewers long after. The emotional core of Interstellar is what stayed with audiences for years to come. That's why Interstellar seems to become more beloved as time goes on. At least in my experience, it never quite leaves you after that first viewing. I said it was a love letter to humanity, and I feel that's genuinely the best way to describe it. It fills the audience with this profound pride in their humanity, and not just to themselves, but the species as a whole. In spite of our faults, all that mankind has accomplished is remarkable when you sit and reflect. In our society, cynicism is on the rise, and honestly it has been for the last couple decades, and that sentiment is understandable. By this film's philosophy, we are meant to be pioneers and explorers, yet we live in a period of human history where there seems to be nothing left to explore. You and I live in a period of time where we're born too late to explore the Earth, and too early to explore the stars. This was a thought that always bothered me when I was younger, and I believe it to be the root cause of much of the cynicism and hopelessness we see in mankind today. We have nothing left to explore, so instead we rot. And while this may seem to be a viable way of life, in reality, we still have reasons to be optimistic. While Interstellar does make me profoundly jealous of the space travel depicted within, as I mentioned at the outset, it's about so much more than that. The core of the story is the relationships between people. Yes, you and I may not be able to travel the cosmos. We can't travel across space and time like the characters in Interstellar, but we do have access to that artifact of a higher dimension as the film describes it. And though it may seem trite, the hope this film provides is simple. It's the transcendent power of love. That love being the key to humanity's future and survival. Nolan describes himself as an optimist, and that is evident with Interstellar. He clearly believes in humanity and has hope for our future. And that simple belief that everything is going to be okay lies at the very core of Interstellar. And perhaps if more people adopted this mindset, it could prove to be the solution to the generational curse of cynicism. Either way, Interstellar has cemented itself as a science fiction classic. It perpetuated the growing popularity of the science fiction genre over the following decade, and it further established Christopher Nolan as the premier filmmaker of his generation. 3 years later, in 2017, Nolan would follow up Interstellar with another original film entitled Dunkirk, which is by far the movie I see discussed the least in his recent catalog. Why is that? Is it simply unremarkable? Or should it be mentioned in the same breath as Nolan's other classics? That's what we'll be finding out next week. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.